The champagne glass shattered against the marble floor. Silence fell over the crowd of elegantly dressed guests, all eyes turning toward us. My husband's face, usually composed, controlled, perfect for the business magazine covers he so frequently graced, had transformed into something ugly. Rage distorted his features as he stared at me, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "You think anyone here respects you?" he snarled, alcohol making him careless with the thoughts he usually kept hidden. "You're just my wife. Nothing more." He laughed then, a cruel sound that cut deeper than any knife could. The faces around us showed a mixture of shock, embarrassment, and that particular brand of delight people feel when witnessing someone else's humiliation. I didn't cry. I didn't run. I smiled. It wasn't the reaction he expected, and for just a moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. "What's so funny?" he demanded, his confidence wavering. I stepped closer, my voice pitched for his ears alone. "That you still think you know who I am." 3 years earlier. "Eleanor, have you met Daniel Harper?" My friend Zoe's voice carried over the ambient chatter of the gallery opening. I turned, champagne flute in hand, to see a tall man with thoughtful gray eyes and an easy smile approaching. His tailored suit suggested wealth, but there was something unassuming in his manner that set him apart from the other financial types who frequented these events. "I haven't had the pleasure," I replied, extending my hand. His grip was warm and firm. "The pleasure's all mine. Zoe tells me you're the brilliant mind behind the new urban sustainability initiative." I shot Zoe a look. She always oversold me, but nodded. "I'm part of the team, yes. We're hoping to transform how cities approach green spaces and resource management." "Modest," Daniel said, his eyes never leaving mine. "Zoe mentioned that too." We talked for nearly 2 hours that night, long after Zoe had floated away to mingle with other guests. Daniel listened intently as I described my passion projects, asking questions that showed genuine interest rather than polite conversation. When he spoke of his investment firm, I found myself drawn to his vision of ethical financing and long-term sustainability over quick profits. By the time he asked for my number, I'd already decided to give it. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Dinners at hidden gems he somehow always knew about. Weekend trips to coastal towns where we'd walk for hours along the shore, planning imaginary futures. He sent books he thought I'd enjoy, each with a handwritten note explaining why the story had made him think of me. "I've never met anyone like you," he told me one evening as we sat on his penthouse balcony. "The city lights spread before us like fallen stars. You see the world differently. You make me want to be better." 4 months after we met, he proposed. 6 months after that, we were married in a ceremony that made the society pages despite my preference for something smaller. "You deserve to be celebrated," he'd insisted. I didn't recognize. Then how the word deserve would come to define our relationship. The cracks appeared slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. A dismissive comment about one of my friends, a business decision that contradicted everything he'd claimed to stand for. Small lies that he explained away so convincingly I questioned my own memory. "You misunderstood," became his refrain. "You're too sensitive," his defense. I'd fallen in love with Daniel Harper, visionary investor with a conscience. But I was married to Daniel Harper, CEO of Harper Financial Group, a man who had built his empire on the backs of others and intended to keep it that way. The woman he'd courted, the environmental consultant with passionate ideals, became an inconvenience once the ring was on my finger. He wanted a wife who would look beautiful at his side, who would charm his business associates, who would maintain his home and eventually bear his children. He wanted an accessory, not a partner. "Your little projects are cute, Eleanor," he said one evening after I'd mentioned returning to work, "but I need you focused on our life together, on building our family, our family." The thought once filled me with warmth. Now it felt like a cage being constructed around me, bar by golden bar. The invitations to events I'd previously attended stopped coming. Friends called less frequently. My world narrowed to the expansive but hollow spaces of our penthouse and the social circuit Daniel deemed appropriate. I might have continued that way, slowly disappearing into the role he'd designed for me. If not for the thumb drive, it was an accident finding it. One of those small, random moments that change everything. Daniel had asked me to retrieve some documents from his home office safe, a rare show of trust. The thumb drive had fallen from between the folders, unmarked and seemingly insignificant. Curiosity, one of the traits Daniel had claimed to love about me before trying to eradicate it, led me to plug it into my laptop after he'd left for work. What I found turned my blood to ice. Financial records, emails, meeting minutes, evidence of systematic fraud, bribery, and market manipulation stretching back years, offshore accounts holding millions that should have gone to shareholders or taxes, environmental impact reports buried and replaced with falsified data, the destruction of communities justified as necessary progress, and worse, proof that Daniel had deliberately targeted me from the beginning. Background checks, surveillance reports, notes on how to win my trust. Subject displays strong ethical principles and environmental concerns. Approach should emphasize shared values and long-term vision. Marriage will provide beneficial public image and access to Lawrence family connections. I was never the woman he loved. I was an acquisition, carefully researched and pursued for maximum benefit to his company and reputation. That night, I smiled through dinner as Daniel talked about his day, the deals he'd closed, the competitors he'd outmaneuvered. I laughed at his jokes and touched his hand across the table. I went to bed beside him and stared at the ceiling until his breathing deepened into sleep. Then I began to plan. Ms. Lawrence, I'm Special Agent Ramirez. Thank you for contacting us. The federal agent sitting across from me in the quiet coffee shop looked younger than I expected, but her eyes held a sharpness that suggested nothing escaped her notice. Thank you for meeting me, I replied, sliding a sealed envelope across the table. Everything I mentioned in my call is in there, along with the original files. She didn't open it, just secured it inside her jacket. This is a significant step you're taking. Are you certain you want to proceed? Was I certain? The question seemed almost laughable after 6 months of careful evidence gathering. 6 months of playing the perfect wife while methodically documenting every illegal transaction, every unethical decision, every manipulative lie. Completely certain, I said. But as I explained, I need time before you move forward. 3 months to be exact. Agent Ramirez studied me with that penetrating gaze. May I ask why? Because bringing down Harper Financial isn't enough. The company is just a shell for Daniel's ego. If it falls while leaving him personally unscathed, he'll simply rebuild elsewhere. I leaned forward. I need to make sure he loses everything, including the things money can't replace. She didn't ask for details. Perhaps she'd seen enough cases like this to understand. Or perhaps she simply recognized the determination in my eyes. 3 months, she agreed. But if we see evidence that funds are being moved or records destroyed, we'll have to act immediately. They won't be. Daniel believes himself untouchable. It's his greatest weakness. As I left the coffee shop, a weight lifted from my shoulders. The first phase was complete. The evidence was secure. Now came the more delicate work. I started with small changes to my appearance and behavior. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger Daniel's suspicion, but enough to make him notice. I colored my hair a shade darker, changed my perfume, began waking earlier to exercise, returning home with a glow that made him look twice. You seem different lately, he remarked over breakfast one morning. I smiled. Do I? I suppose I'm just finding myself again. His expression flickered between approval and wariness. He liked improvements to his possessions but distrusted independence. Next came the social chess game. I re-established connections with friends Daniel had pulled me away from, carefully framing it as building useful networks for his benefit. I volunteered for charitable causes that put me in contact with influential people, many of whom I discovered had their own reasons to distrust Daniel Harper. Margaret Winslow invited us to her foundation gala, I told him, knowing the Winslow family controlled access to investors Daniel had been courting for months. Us? You mean me? He corrected automatically. Actually, the invitation came through my volunteer work. She specifically asked for both of us. I kept my tone light, unassuming. I thought you'd be pleased. He was, though he'd never admit it. Daniel began bringing me to more events, showcasing his beautiful, charming wife as an asset rather than hiding me away as he had before. Little did he know that at each gathering I was building my own network, sharing carefully crafted stories that planted seeds of doubt about Daniel's business practices and personal character. The final element was the most dangerous, creating distance in our marriage without raising alarms. I became slightly less available, both emotionally and physically. Not rejecting, never confrontational, just increasingly occupied with my own affairs. When he reached for me at night, I responded with decreasing enthusiasm. When he spoke of future plans, I listened politely, but offered no input of my own. I became a ghost in our marriage, present but somehow unreachable. It drove him mad, though he couldn't articulate why. He bought expensive gifts I accepted with perfunctory thanks. He planned elaborate dates I attended with pleasant detachment. He even, remarkably, asked about my interests. Too late to recognize I'd developed entirely new ones. "What do you want, Eleanor?" He finally demanded one night, frustration breaking through his control. I looked at him with genuine curiosity. "Why do you ask that now after 3 years of marriage?" The question hit him like a physical blow. He had no answer. 2 weeks later, at the Harper Financial Group's annual charity gala, everything came to a head. The gala was a spectacle of wealth and influence, with Harper Financial Group's top clients, business partners, and a carefully selected group of politicians all mingling beneath crystal chandeliers. I wore a gown in deep emerald that Daniel had never seen before, my hair styled in a way that emphasized the changes in my appearance over recent months. I looked like myself, but somehow more, as though I'd stepped out from behind a veil. Throughout the evening, I moved through the crowd with purpose, exchanging meaningful glances with people Daniel didn't realize I knew. The SEC investigator who'd been building a parallel case to the evidence I'd provided. The journalist whose recent articles had begun questioning Harper Financial's reported profits. The former employee whose whistleblower statement was currently sealed in a judge's chambers, all pieces on a chessboard, positioned for the endgame. Daniel watched me from across the room, his expression darkening as he drained his third scotch. I could read his thoughts in the tightening of his jaw. Who was this woman wearing his wife's face, commanding attention he believed belonged to him? When I stepped onto the small stage to present the ceremonial donation check, a role Daniel had always played in previous years, something in him snapped. He intercepted me before I could reach the microphone, gripping my elbow with fingers that pressed too hard. "What are you doing?" he hissed. I smiled serenely. The foundation director asked me to present the check since I've been working closely with them this year. "Is there a problem?" Around us, guests were beginning to notice the tension. Daniel's business smile faltered as he glanced at the watching crowd. "We'll discuss this later," he said, releasing my arm and stepping back. I approached the microphone, speaking warmly about the foundation's work and Harper Financial's commitment to community support. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew what was coming, but to everyone else. I was simply the devoted wife representing her husband's company with grace. When I returned to Daniel's side, his composure had fractured further. The alcohol, the public diminishment, and months of subtle psychological warfare had worn down his defenses. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" he murmured as we posed for photographs, his smile rigid. "Enjoying what, Daniel? Playing whatever game you think you're playing." His voice was low but vicious. "Did you forget who made you? Who gave you this life?" I turned to him, my expression perfectly composed for the cameras. "I haven't forgotten anything." Something in my tone must have revealed more than I intended, because sudden wariness flashed in his eyes. For the first time, Daniel looked at me and saw not his wife but an adversary. The realization terrified him. He drank more heavily after that, watching as I conversed easily with his most important clients, laughed with business partners who had previously only acknowledged me as an extension of my husband. His legendary self-control eroded with each empty glass, when I excused myself from his side to speak with Margaret Winslow, whose family's investment Daniel had failed to secure. Despite months of effort, he followed, interrupting our conversation with forced joviality. "I hope my wife isn't boring you with household matters," he said. Placing a proprietary hand on my lower back, Margaret raised an eyebrow. On the contrary, Eleanor was just explaining her proposal for integrating sustainable practices into urban development projects. Fascinating stuff. We should have been talking to her all along. Daniel's hand tensed against my spine. Eleanor doesn't work in development. She's been focused on our home. Actually, Margaret replied, she's been consulting with our foundation for months. Surely you knew. The look Daniel gave me contained pure betrayal. In his mind, I had stepped outside the boundaries he'd established, claimed professional recognition that should have been directed toward him, and worse, I had done it without his knowledge or permission. That was when he grabbed the champagne glass from a passing server and drained it in one swallow, already reaching for another as he pulled me aside. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his voice rising enough that nearby conversations paused. I met his gaze calmly. "Having a conversation with Margaret." "Is there a problem?" "Don't play innocent. You've been undermining me all night. All these people looking at you, listening to you?" He broke off, struggling to articulate what exactly I had done wrong. "I wasn't aware that was forbidden," I said quietly. Something dangerous flashed in his eyes. "You know exactly what you're doing. Making me look weak. Making people think you're something more than what you are. And what am I, Daniel?" That was when it happened. The moment when all his pretenses fell away, when the careful facade he maintained in public crumbled under the weight of alcohol and threatened ego. "You think anyone here respects you?" he snarled, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet ballroom. "You're just my wife. Nothing more." He laughed, that cruel sound that seemed to echo in the silence that had fallen over the crowd, and I smiled. The uncertainty in his eyes was worth every moment of the past 3 years. Every humiliation, every lonely night, every lie I had endured. "What's so funny?" he demanded. I stepped closer, my voice pitched for his ears alone. "That you still think you know who I am." Before he could respond, his phone rang, the special tone reserved for urgent business matters. Even drunk and enraged, conditioning took over. He answered. I watched as his face transformed, color draining away as he listened to the voice on the other end. "That's impossible," he said hoarsely. "Those records are secured. The accounts are—" He stopped, looking at me with dawning horror. "I'll call you back." Around us, other phones were buzzing now. Guests glanced at screens, then at Daniel with new expressions. Shock, disgust, calculation. "What have you done?" he whispered. I took a sip of champagne. "Nothing you didn't teach me, darling. I just paid attention to the lessons." His phone rang again. And again. Each call bringing news worse than the last. The federal investigation had gone public. Accounts were being frozen. Indictments were being prepared. The carefully constructed empire of Harper Financial Group was collapsing in real time, its foundations revealed as rotten, and everyone was watching. Daniel grabbed my arm, fingers digging painfully into my flesh. "Fix this," he ordered, as though I were still the compliant wife who existed only to serve his needs. "I can't fix what was broken from the beginning," I replied, pulling free of his grasp. "And I wouldn't if I could." "You bitch," he hissed, all pretense abandoned. "You planned this. All of it." I looked at him with genuine pity. "You made it remarkably easy, Daniel. You were so convinced of your own brilliance that you never imagined anyone could outsmart you, especially not just your wife." Understanding dawned in his eyes, followed by something close to fear. "The thumb drive. You found it months ago. But that was just the beginning." I leaned closer, my voice softening. "Did you really think I wouldn't discover who you truly are? What you've done? Who you destroyed to build your precious company?" "Those were business decisions," he said automatically, the defense he'd used to justify every unethical choice. "Nothing personal. Neither is this, I replied. Just business. I turned to walk away, but he caught my wrist, desperation replacing anger. Eleanor, please. We can fix this together. Whatever they're offering you, protection, immunity, I can give you more. For a moment, I allowed myself to remember the man I thought I had married. The thoughtful eyes, the conversations that lasted until dawn, the future we had planned. A future that had never been real. You have nothing I want, Daniel. You never did. I gently removed his hand and stepped back, creating a distance that felt symbolic as much as physical. Goodbye, Daniel. Margaret Winslow appeared at my side, a silent offer of support. Beyond her, I could see Agent Ramirez waiting by the exit, her expression professional, but her eyes approving. As I walked away, Daniel called after me, his voice breaking. You can't leave me, not now. Everything I did was for us. I paused, turning to face him one last time. The crowd had formed a circle around him, no longer bothering to hide their attention. No, Daniel. Everything you did was for yourself. I'm just the one who finally made you pay for it. 6 months later. The coastal town was exactly as I remembered it from that early trip with Daniel, when possibilities had seemed as endless as the horizon. The small cottage I'd purchased sat on a bluff overlooking the ocean, far from the financial districts and society events that had defined my married life. I set my mug of tea on the porch railing and unfolded the newspaper. Daniel's face stared back at me from below the headline, Harper sentenced to 18 years for fraud. Market manipulation. The article detailed the fall of Harper Financial Group, the millions in restitution ordered, the former clients and employees who had testified against the man once considered untouchable. There was a small mention of my role, the evidence I'd provided, my testimony that had sealed his fate, but I had declined all interview requests. Let Daniel keep the spotlight he had always craved, even in disgrace. Heavy reading for such a beautiful morning. I looked up to see Alex standing in the doorway, her artist's hands stained with paint, her smile gentle but knowing. We had met at a local gallery 3 months after I left New York, both of us starting over in our own ways. Just closing a chapter, I replied. Folding the paper closed, she came to stand beside me, following my gaze to the waves breaking against the shore below. Regrets? I considered the question carefully. Not for Alex's benefit, but for my own. Did I regret the years lost? The love that had never been real? The calculated way I had orchestrated Daniel's downfall? Not regrets, I said finally. Just recognition of the cost. She nodded, understanding without needing details. One of the things I treasured about her. Your lawyer called while you were out walking, she said. The foundation received the final transfer of funds from the settlement. Everything Daniel tried to hide in those offshore accounts. I smiled, genuine pleasure warming me at the news. The money, millions that Daniel had stolen from, investors and taxpayers, had been directed to the environmental initiatives he had once mocked as my little projects. Communities he had intended to exploit would instead be revitalized. Ecosystems he would have destroyed would be protected. It wasn't revenge, not exactly. More like restoration of balance. He asked for another meeting, Alex added carefully. Daniel, I mean. His attorney contacted yours. The request didn't surprise me. Since his conviction, Daniel had made repeated attempts to see me. Each one declined. Whatever closure he sought would have to come from within himself. The same answer as before, I said. Alex squeezed my hand gently. You don't owe him anything. I know. And I did know, finally and completely. The lesson had been hard won. My phone buzzed with an incoming message. Zoe, checking if I'd be back in the city for her gallery opening next month. Another piece of my old life that had survived the transition to the new. Life went on, reshaped but not defined by the past. Later that afternoon, I walked along the shore alone, letting the wind tangle my hair and the salt spray kiss my skin. I thought about the woman I had been when Daniel first brought me here, hopeful, trusting, seeing the best in others even when evidence suggested otherwise. That woman was gone, transformed through pain and betrayal into someone stronger, more cautious, but no less capable of hope. I had survived being reduced to just a wife. I had reclaimed the parts of myself that Daniel had tried to erase. And in doing so, I had discovered new aspects of my character: resilience, strategic thinking, the capacity for justified ruthlessness when necessary. As the sun began to set, painting the water in shades of gold and crimson, I stopped to watch the light change. In the shifting colors, I could almost see the outline of different possible futures stretching before me, each one entirely my own. Nothing more, Daniel had said that night. Believing it the ultimate dismissal, he had been wrong. I was so much more, and now, finally, I was free to discover exactly how much.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.